let's take a look at the basic structure of a C# program. Now I've gone and fired up the C# Express development tool. I'm going to create a new project by clicking the New Project link here on the left-hand side, and the New Project dialog comes up. Throughout this course, we're going to be using console applications to build our examples because they are one of the simplest applications to create, and they allow us to focus on just the C# language without having to worry about all the user interface related code that other projects require. I'm going to select the console application option, and I'm going to give it a name. I will just call this one Structure C#, and I'm going to click OK. At this point, C# Express will create a new project and open it for me, and it will drop me in the editor into a file called program.cs. C# code is stored in files that have the .cs file extension, and right now we only have one of these, but your application can use as many of these files as you like, and in fact, as you build your programs, you'll probably create many different .cs files to group related classes and pieces of your code together, rather than just type thousands of lines into one file. For now, we've only got one, so let's go through this file line by line. Right at the top here, we have a bunch of using statements. These statements tell the C# compiler which pieces of the .NET framework that my project will be using, and they allow me to write my code using a bit of a shorthand notation that we'll see more of in a few minutes. Now, if you're familiar with other languages like, say, Java or C or C++, these using statements are sort of analogous to things like import statements or include statements and so on. But in C# we use the using statement to indicate which pieces of the .NET namespaces I'm using in my program. The next line down is the namespace declaration for this project, and that's here on line 6. Now, I mentioned earlier that C# uses something called namespaces to organize code into related groups or modules, and your program is no different. Namespaces are basically just an organizational tool. They keep related code together, and they prevent certain kinds of problems. Now, for example, if your program were to define a class that has the same name as a class in some other .NET library, either from Microsoft or some other third party, your program's namespace would keep those two classes from colliding with each other and causing a whole bunch of compile problems. Now, the C# editor creates the namespace for you when you create your project, and it defaults to the name of the project, and we're just going to leave this as it is for now. Next, we have something called a class definition. You can see that here on line 8. It's the keyword class followed here by the word program. And again, I mentioned earlier that in C# almost everything's an object, and again, your program is no exception. In C#, the way that you define and create objects is by using the class keyword, which we'll see more of later in the course. And again, we're just going to leave this as it is for now. Inside the class definition is the most important part of our C# program, the main function, and you can see that here on line 10. Now, if you're already familiar with languages like C, Java, Objective-C, and so on, then this will look familiar to you. If not, let me explain. When .NET goes to run your C# program, it needs to know where to start, and the main function is that starting point. It doesn't matter how many functions or lines of code your application contains. Somewhere in your program, .NET expects to find one special function called main, and that's where it begins running your program. It has to be written as you see it here. It needs to be called main, and the first letter must be uppercase because C# is a case-sensitive language. Case does matter here. Because if you try to ignore case in C#, whether it's for function names or variable names or anything else, you are in for a bunch of problems. Now, it's important to note that not all C# project types have a main functions, for example, ASP.NET pages, but many of them do. Now, this isn't something that you'll ever have to worry about, though, because when you're using the Visual C# programming tools to create projects, it will create the main function for you if it's needed. Don't worry for now what the words static or void mean, or the stuff that's inside the parentheses. We're going to cover those later. Let's take a look at some of the syntax rules of C#. Now, first, notice these curly braces on lines 7 and 9, 11, 12, 13, and 14. These braces are used to group related lines of code together in what are called statement blocks of code, and you can see that they come in pairs. There's an opening brace and there's a closing brace, and they must match up. Now, they define starting and ending points for things like functions and classes and loops, all of which we will see later in the course. And if you have experience in languages like JavaScript or C or Java, then you've seen these before. And if not, then all you need to know is that they group lines of code together. Now, you'll notice that the main function is empty, and that's okay, because technically this is a complete C# program. But let's look at some basic examples of C# statement syntax. To declare a variable, I need to specify a type and a name. So, for example, I can type int and then my variable. This is different from languages like JavaScript, where you don't need to specify a type for your variable. Now, note also that every statement in C# must end with a semicolon, as I've done here. Some other languages like JavaScript, for example, don't require this, but C# does. Every time you type a statement, whether it's a variable declaration or you call a function or any kind of statement that you write in the code, has to end with a semicolon. That's a really great practice because it really makes it clear where statements end. Now, in C#, I can use some of the built-in .NET objects, since I've included them in those namespaces using the using statements. For example, the console object. So let me just show you a quick example. I'm going to start typing the word console. And you can see that as I'm typing, the Visual C# Express development tool is helping me out here by trying to guess what it is I'm going to type. And you can see it's centered on the word console there in the little pop-up. So if I hit return, it'll put the word console for me. Console is one of the built-in objects in .NET when you're using console applications. For example, to write something out to the console, I can use the write line function. So I'm going to type dot, and once again that little code hinter comes up, and I'm start using the word write, and you can see that it zeroes in on some of the functions available to me. I'll just choose the write line function, and I will just simply write out something like this. Once again, notice that I've got a semicolon at the end of my statement. The other thing that you should notice is that in C#, strings are contained within 2 double quotes. And we'll cover a lot of this a little bit later in the course. But if you're coming from languages where strings can be specified using either single or double quotes, that's not the case in C#. You have to use double quotes. Now, notice how the word console is in light blue. That's because the compiler notices that I'm using a built-in object in C#, and the console object is contained within the system namespace. Watch what happens when I go up here and I comment out the using system statement up here on line 1. Notice now I've got this little red squiggle down here on my console object. It says the name console does not exist in the current context when I mouse over it. So now I've gone from being able to use this object to not being able to use this object. The reason for this is when I commented out the system namespace, if I want to be able to use that object now, I have to write what's called a fully qualified path name. So I would have to write out system.console.writeLine if I wanted to use this now. And you can see that when I put the word system in front of the word console, now it goes back to being light blue because the compiler recognizes it again. So by using these using statements, I can write my code using shorthand rather than having to write out these big, long, fully qualified paths to all the objects in .NET. So it makes writing your code a lot easier. So I'll go back up to the top here and uncomment that line. You notice even when I have it uncommented, I can leave it fully qualified if I want to, but now I have the ability to take out that system statement, and now console goes back to being recognized. White space doesn't really matter in C#. Now, some languages consider the indentation level of lines of code to be important, but C# does not. You can put as much or as little white space in your program statements as you like. For example, I could put this statement all the way over here, and I can just put this statement all the way back over here. It doesn't really matter. This is all good. Obviously, there are places where white space is going to matter. So, for example, inside of a string, if I do this, well, that's pretty significant. That's going to affect the way that that string is written out. But within lines of code, white space does not matter. So if you're coming from a language where white space matters, you don't have to worry about that here. Indentation in C# is just used for maintaining readability. So we've seen enough C# where we can now start writing our programs, and we can go on to the next part of the course.